Hi there, and welcome to One Idea Away, not just a podcast, but a community and ongoing conversation meant to inspire and empower individuals to live more fully, deeply, and consciously. Let's jump into today's episode right now. Take a moment and just breathe. Breathe naturally. Feel the rhythm of your breath. Feel the sensation of the airflow. Feel the way that your body moves on the inhale and the exhale. Being mindful, bringing our attention to our breath is one of those ways that we can relax. We can bring ourselves to a calmer place and let off some of the tension that's built up. But breathing can contribute to our well-being in a completely different way, and in ways that I honestly had no idea of until I discovered some of the work that we're going to chat about today. Because there is a whole lot more to breathing that would be really good for us to be aware of. And so when I ran across the work that our guest today does, it was an eye-opener. Normally, I would even joke with you that it was a lung opener, but turns out that may not be the way that we want to go. And so we'll dive into some of that as well. So we're going to focus a bit on breathing. We're going to talk about oxygen today because much of what Patrick McKeown has to share is really important to our total health and well-being. And to me, the benefits of this work are far beyond the physical, although there's a lot of those too. And if you also happen to be someone who, kind of like me, likes challenging themselves with sports and athletics, a bit of a weekend warrior for running and biking and hiking and things like that, well, this is also going to help you perform better in those areas as well. But this really, truly is for everybody to make a major leap in their well-being. So with that in mind, our guest today is international best-selling author and master instructor, Patrick McKeown. He's the creator of the Oxygen Advantage technique and the author of the book, Oxygen Advantage. Over the last 15 years, he has trained more than 7,000 people around the world to safely challenge their bodies and produce positive changes, from delayed lactic acid and fatigue to improved aerobic and lung capacity and reduction of risk of injury, as well as to improved psychological preparedness. This impacts the way you sleep. This can impact the stress levels that you have. Like I said, it impacts your overall total well-being. So please dial in and pay attention to this one. So with that in mind, Patrick, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast, One Idea Away.
You're very welcome. Thanks very much, Luke.
Patrick, to kind of kick us off, what would you say is really the main message, the main idea that's at the core of your work that you really want people to understand?
I think really there's two aspects to it. First and simple is to breathe through the nose, both during rest and also during sleep, during wakefulness and also during sleep. And the second aspect is to consider the volume of air that you're breathing, because the harder you breathe, the less oxygen gets delivered to the tissues.
We're going to dive into exactly how some of that works and what the implications are. But just before we do, I'm curious, in terms of your own background, what is it that drew you ultimately to this work?
Sure. I came across it. It was totally by accident. I never dreamed of working in this field. If somebody told me I was going to work into it, I probably would have run away, to be honest with you. I came from a background of economics. My degree is in economics. I was in the corporate world. I was highly stressed. I had 20 years of asthma. I had sleep issues. Generally, if you have breathing problems, as I did with asthma, my nose was always obstructed because there's a link between the lungs and the upper airways. So if there's inflammation in the nose, there's also generally inflammation in the lungs. And if there's inflammation in the lungs, it travels up to the nose. And if your nose is congested, you're twice as likely to have sleep problems. So it's not just that the congested nose causes sleep problems, but a congested nose causes you to mouth breathe. And breathing through your mouth increases the risk of sleep issues. So as somebody with asthma, I was breathing issues, sleep issues, poor concentration, and higher stress levels. And those are the main kind of characteristics of how a breathing pattern disorder can affect you. So I was, at one point I was just reading a newspaper and I read the work of a Russian doctor, Konstantin Buteyko. And he said two things. He said, breathe through your nose, and he said, breathe less. So I went back into the university library. This is when internet was in its infancy. And I found the exercises to open up the nose. And it's simply holding the breath. Now, bear in mind, I had an operation on my nose in 1994. And The operation was a success, but the surgeons never told me to breathe through it. And I didn't breathe through it. So I kept sleeping with my mouth open. I kept having my mouth open. So in reality, it didn't make any difference to me. And, that's just the way it is. And that's the way it is to this present day, that breathing generally doesn't get a whole lot of attention unless it's not up to par. Now, so it was after a couple of years I decided I'd love to start teaching this. And I contacted the Russian embassy to try and track somebody down who could speak Russian, because of course in Ireland we didn't have a whole lot of immigration at that point. So, and then I traveled over to Russia. I trained there, and then I come back to Ireland. So I've been working with this since about 17 years or so.
One of the phrases that you just used in there, which I find really interesting, is the notion of breathing less. It's just not something that I would normally expect to hear. So what do you mean breathe less? Why breathe less?
Well, I suppose if you were taking a run with an elite athlete, you'll see that elite athlete for a given level of exercise is going to be breathing fairly easy. And conversely, somebody who's very unfit and very unhealthy, they get very, very breathless quick. Unhealthy people tend to breathe fast and they breathe hard. And healthy people, it's relatively difficult to see their breathing during rest. And these are just habits. It's almost like plasticity, that the brain forms new habits based on stimulus from the environment. And many factors change our breathing, and factors of modern living change our breathing. Genetics play a role. Stress plays a role. But I think the easiest way to understand about breathing is to look, how do we breathe when we get stressed? So when we get stressed, most people will be aware that our breathing gets faster. We breathe more using the upper chest. We sigh more. We take more air into our lungs. Our breathing often becomes audible and it becomes more noticeable. And then if I was to say somebody, say from the general public, take a deep breath, they'll take this fast breath, often using the upper chest, using in through the mouth. And they're taking a big amount of air into their lungs. And I explain, this is only exaggerating the stress response. I say, how would you feel if you took 10 of those big breaths? And they'll tell me they feel lightheaded. Well, that's really where it's at, because stress is changing breathing patterns, but also our breathing patterns will influence stress.
Right.
Now, if stress causes our breathing to get faster and harder and heavier, well, then surely it makes more sense to bring the body into relaxation to do the opposite. Breathe through the nose. And it's only by breathing through the nose that you breathe deeply, by the way. The nose is directly linked to the diaphragm. The mouth is directly linked to the upper chest. And breathing through your nose is activating the diaphragm. It slows down breathing. It improves arterial oxygen uptake, but it also improves oxygen delivery to the cells. And also by slowing down breathing, Stanford researchers in March of last year, they identified a cluster of neurons which is pretty much spying on your breath. But if you breathe fast, this part of the brain which is spying on your breathing will relay signals of agitation to the rest of the brain. And if you really slow down your breathing, this part of the brain will convey signals of calm and tranquility. So there's a huge link between our breathing and stress levels. And I think we can make a massive change to our stress by focusing on the breath and also by addressing breathing pattern disorders.
That's interesting. The way in which our breathing ties into our stress response, something that I've seen, and I believe that I have this reasonably correct, is that part of our brain is typically what the amygdala, correct? That's watching for the way in which we're breathing. And what that does, and for everybody why this is so important, is that if your amygdala is receiving signals from your body, from your breathing, that seem like it's mimicking a stress response, then it will more likely kick you into that fight or flight, which will further perpetuate what you're going through. Right. It'll also change the way in which you interact with and see the world in front of you, which creates more stress, which creates more labored breathing, and so on into the spiral, right?
Yeah, so, and if you breathe through your mouth, you'll tend to breathe faster. So you can imagine the amount of individuals who are breathing through their mouth at night. They're breathing hard, they're breathing heavy. It's drying out the upper airways, it's drying out their mouth, and their upper airways become a little bit inflamed. It can happen. And this causes the airways to become narrow. This increases the negative pressure during breathing, and then this increases the risk of snoring and obstructive sleep apnea. So obstructive sleep apnea is a huge issue. It's estimated to be responsible for 20% of road car accidents. It decreases productivity. It puts a huge stress on the heart. and it significantly reduces overall quality of life. If you breathe through your nose during sleep, you'll significantly reduce the risk of obstructive sleep apnea. And conversely, if you have your mouth open, you significantly increase the risk of it.
Well, it's interesting because, and I guess, for everybody, I think part of what's coming into the public consciousness is the importance of proper amounts of rest and of sleep. But obviously, Patrick, what you're describing is the quality of that sleep, and obviously, breathing is such a huge impact on that quality.
It's huge, Luke, and you know what? It's seldom that quality is often looked at. Like I'm reading more recent books, the Sleep Revolution, etc., and very few people are talking about the importance of nose breathing, but one person is, and his name is Dr. Christian Guilleminault. He's also a Stanford medical doctor, but he discovered obstructive sleep apnea back in the 1970s. And he also developed the apnea-hypopnea index. Now, in the last 2 to 3 years, he's published quite a few papers where he's the co-author, and it's talking about the importance of nasal breathing during both wakefulness and also during sleep. And this is not new. There's been studies back to the 1980s whereby they did tests on individuals. They obstructed their nose on one night, and then they made sure they breathed through their nose on another night. And the sleep nights that they had the mouth open, their sleep quality was significantly reduced. They spent more time in light sleep. One individual out of 8 developed obstructive sleep apnea, and they were waking up feeling unrefreshed. And I think this was a huge insight for me. I was 20 years with my mouth open, and I was waking up exhausted every morning, but you accept that's who you are, even though I was a teenager into my early 20s. When I started breathing through my nose, that's when I started waking up refreshed. And there's a huge difference. And, if you wake up with a good night's sleep, you're going to be naturally calmer. You're naturally going to be productive. You've got better concentration. You can't expect somebody to have clarity of mind, calmness of thoughts, and concentration unless they've got a good night's sleep. And I think it's great that sleep is getting more attention now, but the nose breathing is a significant part of that, and that's really where it's going to be at.
And just for everybody, part of, and obviously we're talking specifically about sleep now. We'll talk about some other things in a moment, but it's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation today, because think about if you woke up having, just a 10%, 15% improvement in your quality of sleep and how much more rested you feel in the morning. Just think about the way that affects your life. Think about how much, as you said, how much calmer you are, the way in which you're going to interact with people is going to be different. What you can focus on is different. And therefore, how you feel at the end of the day based on maybe what you accomplished or what you experienced that day is going to feel better. And again, it creates a really positive cycle. So I guess, Patrick, let me ask then. So we've talked about, actually, one other comment on that before we switch to kind of how should we be doing this is the idea that when you mentioned it in terms of sleep apnea and things like that, but this is also about, for each of us, how can we achieve more of that optimal well-being for ourselves? So you're using some of the examples, obviously, that stand out to people and unfortunately affect a lot of people out there. For somebody, even like myself, I don't have those type of issues, but I know exactly. I couldn't believe the number of things that I identified with in your book in terms of signs of a little fatigue here, restlessness here, those types of things and the ramifications it has. So this is something that's really important just for everybody. It seems like this is something simple, but it is highly impactful to quality of living. So Patrick, if I frame back to you then, what are we meant to do? What is more the way that we're meant to breathe overall? Because I even enjoyed some of the background and the stories in the book of how many of the ancient tribes had it right, meaning this was something we used to do really well.
Totally. Yeah. Our ancestors had it. First and foremost is breathing both in and out through the nose. And second is to breathe light. Now, I think it's very useful for your audience even to try the exercises. To open up the nose. It's been documented since 1923 that if you hold your breath, it will help decongest your nose. Now, this isn't suitable for, say, somebody who's pregnant or if somebody has serious health conditions, including, say, heart issues. But for somebody in relatively good health, if you want to open up your nose, take a light or just a normal gentle breath into your nose, a normal gentle breath out through your nose, pinch your nose with your fingers and walk around holding your breath. and continue walking around until you feel a kind of medium air hunger, or even a little bit stronger, medium to stronger air hunger. And when you do, then let go of your nose, but breathe in through your nose, and then just calm your breathing. And wait a minute and do it again. And if you do that 5 or 6 times, your nose will start opening. So you can directly influence your nasal airways, but also your lungs by changing your breathing. And that's by just doing a breath hold. Now, another aspect of breathing is you can also influence your blood circulation. You can change your body temperature in about 3 to 4 minutes by changing your breathing. And you can also activate the parasympathetic response. In other words, the rest and digest or relaxation response. And this is a very simple thing to do when people aren't driving. Just sit into a nice, comfortable chair, reasonably good posture, but bring a feeling of relaxation throughout the body. And you can put one hand on your chest and one hand just above your navel and just gently tune into your breathing. Feel the airflow as it comes into your nose, feel the airflow as it leaves your nose. And as you feel the airflow coming in and out of your nose, purposely slow down the speed of your breathing. So purposely slow down the speed of the air as it comes into the nose, and purposely have a gentle and slow, relaxed breath out. Wait until you feel the need to breathe in again, and then have a purposely slower and gentle and softer breath in. And at the top of the breath, which should be gentle, a relaxed, gentle breath out. So the aim is to slow down your breathing sufficiently so that you're taking in about 30% less air into your lungs. Now, you're going to feel air hunger. And if you feel air hunger, it's a good sign. And by the way, the air hunger is not signifying that oxygen is dropping. It's not, because the stimulus to breathe is actually carbon dioxide. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. As you slow down your breathing and you feel air hunger, your body temperature will start to increase. And also, ironically, more oxygen gets delivered to the cells. And another aspect is that you'll generally feel increased watery saliva in the mouth. And yogi have known for hundreds of years that when we get stressed, our mouth gets dry. But you can bring your body from a sympathetic state, from a stress state, into a relaxed state in about 4 minutes. Yeah. And it's almost like a meditation, but it's going one step further. When you go into deep meditation, your breath automatically slows. So sometimes people can get a little bit frustrated with meditation or with anapanasati because the mind will tend to wander quite a bit. So we're doing it a little bit differently. We're focusing on the breath, which is, a meditation, but we're deliberately slowing down the breath to get air hunger. And the mind is very anchored on the breath when you've got air hunger. So with the mind more anchored, it's also going to help reduce, active thoughts. So it's a good meditation in itself, but also it's addressing the physiology of stress, because as you slow down your breathing and you get air hunger, the carotid arteries, which are feeding the brain with oxygen, will dilate, and you'll actually get improved blood flow and improved oxygen to the brain. That's got a calming effect. So I think in terms of dealing with stress, we need to look at the physiology of it. We need to look at the biomechanical in terms of don't be breathing using the upper chest during rest. But in order to establish diaphragmatic breathing, which does improve arterial oxygen uptake and has a calming response, it's very important to breathe through the nose. You can't breathe using the diaphragm if you go around with your mouth open. Any of your people, they can check that out. Just look down at your chest, take a breath through the mouth, and you'll automatically see that mouth breathing is linked with chest breathing, and chest breathing and mouth breathing are sympathetic. They're fight or flight. So we need to get nose breathing, slow breathing, and you can literally, in a few minutes, improve your blood circulation, improve oxygen delivery to the cells, and help open up the airways. And I think just the understanding of it, the best way to do is practice it. Yeah. It's just give it a go. You're sitting down, you're watching something on television, you're bringing your attention to your breathing, and your whole aim is to deliberately underbreathe to the point that you have a tolerable air shortage. Not that you're stressed. If you get a little bit stressed, just allow your breathing to go back to normal. And try and maintain it for 3 or 4 minutes, So you might find you're slowing down your breath. If it gets a bit stressful for you, take a rest for 20 seconds and then come back to it. And check how your body changes in response to your breathing. And that's then, it's very good for that understanding.
I think it's part of the fun of this as well, is that while there's an incredible scientific underpinning of everything that you're talking about, there's so much here that we can verify for ourselves just based on some practice and experience, relatively firsthand, right? As simple as sitting in front of the TV, like you just said. It's I think again, I want to just tie into the one piece that you brought up specifically around being able to switch from our sympathetic to parasympathetic systems, meaning from our stress response to our non-stress response to our much more calm state. Breathing is one of the ways that is accomplished, and very quickly. You heard only in 3 to 4 minutes that can ultimately be accomplished. And what Patrick's talking about is not only doing that, because that's been work of mindfulness and meditation and centering and breathing exercises for a long time, was creating that connection. But now add into it the information that Patrick's sharing about why you do want to breathe lightly, why you want to create a little bit of that hunger for air, because it has another impact, kind of an extra impact that reaches you much deeper. And I guess, Patrick, if you mentioned that idea that air hunger is not only a good sign, and you alluded to some of that and talked about some of that, but that it also relates to CO2. And this, to me, honestly, was one of those eye openers to me, because you hear carbon dioxide, and for most of us, we immediately hear, oh yeah, that's what we want to get rid of. That's something that's not good for us. And can you kind of just dispel a little bit of that myth, because I had no idea why this was so important.
Yeah, for some reason, it's kind of crept into physiology, or at least popular physiology, that it's good to breathe in oxygen and it's good to get rid of as much carbon dioxide. But back in 1904, there was a Danish physiologist called Christian Bohr, and he discovered what's now called the Bohr effect. And basically, when we take a breath, oxygen passes from the lungs into the blood, and most oxygen in the blood is carried by a molecule called hemoglobin. But in order for hemoglobin to release its load of oxygen, it does so in the presence of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is coming from the cells, and as a result, the increased CO2 will drop blood pH, and the affinity then for hemoglobin and oxygen reduces. So in order for oxygen to be released from the blood to the cells, we need CO2. But if we're breathing hard, and even going around with our mouth open and breathing a little bit heavy, or having a sigh every now and again, or upper chest breathing, kind of typical traits that we see all the time, what's happening is that we're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide from the lungs, but it's getting rid of CO2 from the lungs will also reduce it in the arterial blood. So pretty much then, our breathing is dictating the amount of CO2 in the blood, and the amount of CO2 in the blood is dictating whether those blood vessels are opening or closing, and also whether oxygen is being released to the cells. So in order to oxygenate our cells better, and by that I'm talking about getting more oxygen to the cells, our breathing needs to be light. We need to dispel the whole aspect of taking big breaths to improve oxygenation. Now, without going too technically, but there's two ways that oxygen is carried in the blood. There's a small amount of oxygen dissolved directly in the blood plasma, and the vast majority of oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. So hemoglobin carries 70 times more oxygen than what otherwise would be. If you have normal breathing and light breathing, your saturation of your hemoglobin, in other words, how fully loaded the hemoglobin is with oxygen, will typically be about 95 to 99%. In other words, it's already almost fully saturated. If you breathe harder, you're not going to increase that. Now, you can increase the amount of oxygen dissolved in the blood, but that's only such a small amount. But your breathing harder is going to get rid of carbon dioxide at the same time. That's going to increase blood pH. And that's why people feel lightheaded when they breathe hard. And at the same time, somebody who's breathing hard all night, often snoring, and they're breathing heavy, they're waking up very tired, and they're waking up exhausted. Not necessarily due to stopping breathing during their sleep, but hard breathing. Somebody who talks for a living, and I'm sure many of your listeners talk for a living. If you talk for a living, you're breathing harder, because talking will increase the respiratory rate, and it also increases the amount of air that you take with each breath. So you'll breathe harder during talking. And, many people out there are going to feel very tired after a day's talking. It's not the mental concentration that's caused the fatigue, but it's the heavy breathing as a result of the talking which caused the fatigue.
So how do we get a sense of where we are right now? Meaning, how do we get a sense of how well do we kind of breathe along the lines of what you're talking about, so that we get the proper level of oxygenation, but also the proper level of balance with the CO2 and the technical side? How do we know where we're at?
Sure. There's a very simple test, and this test was developed by Dr. Konstantin Butek, but other researchers also concluded it. Stanley in 1975 and Nishino in 2009. And they said your breath hold time provides an indirect measurement of end-tidal CO2, or quite simple. You need a watch with a second hand. Take a normal breath into your nose, a normal breath out through your nose, pinch your nose with your fingers, and count how many seconds it takes until you feel the first definite desire to breathe. And then let go, but breathe in through your nose. But your breath should be relatively calm. The lower your breath hold time during rest, the harder you breathe. And the harder you breathe, the more, say, your sports breathlessness would be affected, or your sleep issues are affected, or even anxiety. We see people with panic attacks. They have an aversion to CO2 because the air hunger brings on the panic. But we want to change that. And by increasing your BOLT score, so I call it BOLT in the book, it's body oxygen level test. Your breath hold time gives you pretty good feedback of your breathing. And there was a very interesting paper published in October of last year. It looked at breath hold time, and it looked at 4 different questions that came from functional movement screen. And basically, it was saying, well, how can we identify breathing pattern disorders, or how can we identify functional breathing in sports? Because if an individual has breathing pattern disorder, it does increase the risk of injury. You need diaphragmatic breathing for stabilization of the spine and for core strength, etc. And they concluded on that paper that if your breath hold time is less than 25 seconds, and if you answer positively to, not necessarily the 4 questions, but in general, you're answering positively to the questions. And the 4 questions were, do you often yawn during the day, or do you notice yourself yawning? Do you feel tense? Do you have cold hands and feet? And do you wake up with a dry mouth in the morning? And those would be all symptoms associated with breathing issues. Because literally through your breath, you're able to influence the airways, you're able to influence your blood circulation. Somebody with cold hands, cold feet, their breathing is too heavy. So they said, if you have a breath hold time of less than 25 seconds, and that's only holding the breath until the first definite desire to breathe, and also that you're relatively positive to those 4 questions, you've got an 89% chance that you've got a breathing pattern disorder. And I think it's very easy. It's very clear cut. I've put up some of the exercise on YouTube. A lot of the science is on YouTube. The breath hold time measurement is on YouTube. And we put up timers and things like that, and people can just check it out. It's very easy. All you need is a watch. You have to be sitting down for about 5 or 10 minutes before you do it. Like, don't be walking around and then do it, because it's a little bit like measuring your heart rate. So normal breath into your nose, normal breath out, pinch your nose, hold your nose, and time it in seconds until you feel the first definite desire to breathe. And the lower your breath hold time, the more breathless you are during sports, and also the harder you breathe during the day.
So Patrick, I do want you to share just maybe one practice, but we'll get to that in a moment. You actually alluded to one before as well. But just before we do that, I'm just curious, what have you seen? What are some of the kind of the results of this work? Because I mean, you shared just a myriad of stories, from athletes to individuals losing weight to all sorts of different responses, let alone your own story of what you've gone through of turning asthma around. Just what are just a couple of the things that stand out to you in terms of those stories of here's what's possible?
Well, in May of last year, we had 2 papers published in the American Journal of Critical Care Medicine, looking at mouth-breathing asthmatic children. We improved all of their lung functions, including their sleep, reduced absenteeism. We've 19 clinical trials looking at changing breathing patterns in asthma. All are positive. I've seen people from elite athletes to people who wouldn't walk 15, 20 yards. And it's very interesting working with, somebody who is an athlete, because we do reduce breathing, because basically how you breathe during the day is going to influence how you breathe during sports. And if you're breathing hard during the day, you're going to be more breathless during sports. So we've seen many athletes get personal best times, giving athletes the tool to be able to push themselves harder without putting the risk of injury. We do simulation of altitude training with athletes. We have them wear pulse oximeters. We use breath holding to lower blood oxygen saturation. We disturb the blood acid base balance, and that caused the body to make adaptations. We've seen people with chronic fatigue, lots of people with stress. I had over a couple of years, I had a huge interest in the whole aspect of mindfulness. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think it's really important not to be stuck in our heads all the time. And we're going to see a huge issue here, Luke, with social media.
Yeah.
You know, it's incredible that our phones are controlling people, and they're controlling people through the constant alerts, text messaging, and literally the brain now is being trained to be distracted. An interesting study on the back of that, in 2002, Microsoft, and I'm just going a small bit off topic and I'll come back. Microsoft did a study in 2002, and I think they looked at between 2,000 and 4,000 Canadians, and they wanted to measure what was the average attention span of a Western person. And they concluded back in 2002 it was 12 seconds.
Wow.
They returned to do the same study in 2012 or 2013 with a similar group of people, and they found that the attention span is reduced to 8 seconds. And they said this is a problem because a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. Now, if you want to find that study, just put in Microsoft goldfish study. Now, what is attention span? But our capacity to hold our attention on something for a period of time without distraction. You need focus. We all need focus in work, in sports, in relationships, in our day-to-day activity. We need the ability to be able to hold our attention because that's going to improve our quality of work. You know yourself, if the mind is active and if the mind is scattered, you don't have your attention doing what you're doing. Your attention is stuck in your head. Yeah. And modern technology is going to generate such mental health problems. And we're just going to start. We don't see that yet. Let's watch this over the next 10 years. And this will happen before we think about it. We need something to counteract. Even though modern technology is bringing so many benefits, we also need to look at what could be the possible downside to it. And focusing on the breath is teaching you to hold your attention exclusively on something. And it's directly improving your concentration. So, that alone is huge. And I bring people in, we've had people with panic attacks, people with anxiety, people with stress. And I'm not saying this is a cure-all or anything like that. No, the main issues that we work with, sleep, panic, anxiety, athletes to improve their sports performance, and asthma. And they would be the main factors. We also work a lot with actually dentists, would you believe? Because if a child has their mouth open, they don't have their tongue resting in the roof of the mouth, and it alters craniofacial development. So pretty much any child who's a mouth-breathing child, it's also going to cause negative changes to their face and contribute to crooked teeth, and they don't get the full development of their jaws because you need a tongue in the roof of the mouth to drive the shape of the face forward, to develop jaws. If you have forward growth of the jaws, it means you've got a good airway. And if you've got a good airway, you're going to be a good athlete. Well, not a good athlete, but it'll help you, towards that goal. But it will also help your sleep. Now, conversely, if you have a child with the mouth open, especially during critical growth periods, they develop negative alterations to the face, and this also reduces airway size. And this is increasing the risk of that child having sleep apnea for the rest of their life. All this stuff is well documented. I included a chapter all right in the book, because I was looking at mainly from a sports point of view, but we need to be teaching children, breathe through your nose. It's not normal to breathe through the mouth.
Number one, just the ramifications of this to me that's why I wanted to share the work that you're doing, because it's amazing to me how much we have not brought our awareness or attention to our breath in terms of how meaningful it really is to the quality of life and all of the different things that it touches. And even something else that you mentioned in terms of the way in which when we connect to our breath in this manner and we breathe with the type of instruction you've described, that we are able to maintain focus. Well, one of the other things that ties to is there's studies that have been done. I think it was Daniel Gilbert, and I believe his partner was Matthew Killingsworth, who studied that without focus, you don't have fulfillment.
Yes.
So
that was a really interesting study, and there was a huge amount of data points as well. Yeah. And they pretty much said that modern man, we're the only animal that our mind continuously kind of wanders. And really what they found out was people whose minds wandered the most were least happy. Yes. And ultimately, this is what it's about, Luke. We're here on earth to fulfill happiness, as you said. And, this is where a scattered mind is. Like, the mind is the one filter through which all of life is experienced.
Yeah.
And yet we don't stand back and ask ourselves, how does it work? And I'm not talking about doing a PhD in the mind. That's theory. I'm talking about just a practical understanding of it. I start focusing on my breath, and I know from talking to yourself that you have a huge interest in this field. And I think you'll never waste time just simply following the breath in and following the breath out for a couple of minutes here and bring it into your way of life. I think that's the main thing.
Patrick, I guess just to kind of bring the conversation around full circle, the one thing I'd love to just hear from you is what's really truly your hope for the difference that this work is going to make?
I think for the generation, I have a huge interest in getting children and teaching them the importance of nasal breathing. It's like we look at it in terms of the child's sleep, their academic achievement, and it probably comes back to mine. I was bright enough when I was a young kid, but in high school, it really went out the window. And I would have been considered one of these children that was disinterested. But nobody was looking at my breathing. And I don't mean that, that, okay, it's a simplified thing. It's not that at all. But if you're waking up tired, it's difficult to focus. There's a huge change. There really, really is. There's a great awareness now that I'm finding in the last 3 years. And I would love to see the importance of breathing and functional breathing coming into awareness for both children and for adults, of course, as well.
Patrick, I want to thank you so much for coming on One Idea Away. This to me was a very enlightening conversation on many, many levels around something that we all do. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Luke.
Absolutely. So for everybody, I want to, number one, I want to encourage you to check out the Oxygen Advantage, check out the book. As Patrick said, if you're looking for a couple of exercises, you want to understand that fit test, that bolt test a bit more, look up the Oxygen Advantage on YouTube, because there's a lot of just wonderful free material that's already out there. And again, I want to encourage everybody to take that moment, take these few moments to connect to your breath, to be able to follow the rhythm of it, to be able to feel the sensation of it, but to also breathe lightly. Breathe through your nose, breathe into your diaphragm, and begin to connect at that level as well. The benefits from this, of breath alone and focusing on the breath alone, goes so much further than just the physical. And the physical is already pretty astounding. But the emotional, the mental, and even spiritual levels that this helps us at is extraordinary. So do me a favor, please check it out and see what type of difference it makes to your experience of life. And with that, guys, I want to thank you as always for stopping in on One Idea Away. And until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post, or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.